Okay, wonderful. I think we are live now, joined both by participants in our Zoom group and on YouTube. Welcome to all. Good afternoon and good evening to those joining us from India and towards the east. Good morning to those joining us towards the west in North America and Europe. My name is Constantino Xavier. I'm a fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress, CSEP, formerly Brookings, India. I'll be hosting and moderating this session for the next hour and a half. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all today here for this virtual launch and discussion on a fabulous new book by Ananth Krishnan titled India's China Challenge. This is the physical copy of the book, the Indian edition. I believe there'll be different editions or at least copies available also beyond India. This is published by HarperCollins and is really a superb overview of China in around 400 pages. Difficult to define, but I would say it's really a mix of different dimensions and different approaches to China. An economic dimension is discussed, the politics of the country, the strategic and foreign policy outlook of China, the social, cultural, historical backgrounds of the country and transformations that are ongoing. All of this sort of Indian northern neighbor and probably India's most consequential partner. This is a non-fiction book, but it's also a book of policy analysis that Ananth goes deeply into. I'd say it's also a book that is a travelogue, a personal memoir based on extensive interactions with different people across different provinces in China. And it's really in the style of what I think we know as some of the best international media correspondence books that write about the countries they have covered, as Ananth has. Ananth spent pretty much 10 years reporting from China since 2009 until 2018, based out of Beijing, but traveling across the country. Ananth, I know you will not admit to it, but I think it's safe, and I will say it, that no other Indian journalist, and maybe few other Indians, know this new China as well as you do today, and that obviously transpires in this book. We were lucky to host Ananth Krishnan as a visiting fellow in the foreign policy program at CSEP, formerly Brookings, India, between 2018 and 19. We hosted him to help him do a lot of his research and work beyond just his media coverage and reporting. This is an outcome in many ways of that time that Ananth Krishnan spent with us. But there's also another interesting report, if you're interested in India-China relations, which is Ananth's recent report, which we launched earlier this year, called Following the Money, China Inc.'s Growing Stakes in the Indian Economy. That is a report that is available on our website and maps India-China economic relations, in particular Chinese economic investments in the tech sector and the new sector since 2014 in the Indian economy. I'll introduce Ananth and our distinguished panelists here today. Three distinguished panelists. We have Ambassador Jaishankar Menon, who's a distinguished fellow at CSEP. We have Ambassador Nirupama Rao, who's also former ambassador to China. And we have Professor Liwu Chen from Hong Kong University. I'll introduce them separately and individually in a second, but let me pass on the word first to Mr. Vikram Singh Mehta for introductory remarks. Vikram Singh Mehta is a chairman and distinguished fellow at CSEP. Previously, he was the executive chairman of Brookings India and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. from 2012 to 2020. Prior to that, Vikram was the chairman of the Shell Group of companies in India from 94 to 2012 and is on the boards of, is an independent non-executive director of several Indian companies. Vikram, up to you for introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Tino. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning. May I just add my words of warm welcome to everyone on this in this sort of conversation. But may I start by expressing my particular appreciation and thanks to Ananth Krishnan for allowing CSEP this opportunity to virtually launch his book. It's a privilege and it's a great pleasure to have had this opportunity. Thank you, Ananth. May I also express my thanks to the panelists, Ambassador Jaishankar Menon. He's an old friend, but from the point of view, from our perspective in Brookings, India and CSEP, he's been a mentor for our foreign policy group for many years, and we owe him a great deal. So thank you, Shankar, for being with us. Ambassador Rao, because she, again, as Tino sort of mentioned, really needs no introduction as far as China is concerned, and I will leave the detailed inductions to Tino, but I really am grateful to you, Nirupama, for having taken the time off to be with us today. And Professor Chen, this is the first time we are meeting, and please let me just say how grateful I am to you for being part of this channel, and part of this conversation. This virtual book launch for us in CSEP is more than just a book launch. It is actually of wider significance. And the reason is that we only formally transited from Brookings, India to CSEP a couple of weeks back. And so in a sense, this is one of the early conversations, webinars, discussions that we are having under the umbrella of CSEP. The logo that you see has not been displayed in this format earlier, and we're really, proud to be able to start our programming activity with this virtual book launch. You may or may not know that Brookings India was and has been in India for the last 7 years, and earlier this year, Brookings DC, Brookings Institution, had determined that they wished to redefine the nature of the relationships that they had with their overseas centers. They have 3 overseas centers, one in China, in Beijing, one in Doha, and one in Delhi. So against that background, we have spent the last 4.5 months actually redesigning our logo, redefining the website, and really, in some senses, reorienting our research agenda. We have also reconstituted the board, and the board met for the first time just last week and elected me as the chairman and Dr. Rakesh Mohan as the president of CSEP. Dr. Mohan is a very distinguished public servant. He was formerly a deputy governor of the central bank, the Reserve Bank of India. He was Secretary Economic Affairs in the government of India. And he was also our India's executive director to the IMF. So we are in CSEP extremely privileged to have him come on board as our president and to lead the research program in particular. Ananth, your book could not be more timely. It cannot be more important. And it's not just because of the fact that India and China are today sort of into the 5th month of their border standoff. The book is important because China is now a major issue for anyone contemplating global issues. And the problem is that we don't quite know what the future is going to look like. We face many challenges. We, meaning the world, faces many challenges. Pandemic is the most recent of it. Earlier, global warming, when we have many other issues that don't respect national boundaries, don't respect ethnicities or any narrow categories of definition. And the question really is, how does the world respond to these daunting uncertainties? And China and the role of China is one such uncertainty. How is China going to exercise its power in the coming years, coming decades? And how should India in particular, how should the world, but in India in particular, respond to these challenges? Can India work with China in a cooperative sense? Will it be, or will it be locked into a struggle, a competitive struggle? What are the red lines that define our national interest, which we will not allow the other party, the other group to cross? I mean, these are questions that I don't have the answers to. I know that you and the panelists will have answers to, but I think that the reason why someone who's a layperson does not have answers is because at times one feels that we haven't actually defined the role of China within a clear strategic framework, at least not in the context of India-China relations. So, you know, I was reflecting before before this sort of discussion as to what is the difference between the Cold War, as we might want to call it, the current Cold War between China and the rest of the world, and the Cold War that embroiled the Soviet Union and America, the capitalist world and the communist world. And the one big difference that I see, which I think we cannot ignore, is that in the earlier years, in the earlier Cold War, it was a discussion and it was a confrontation over politics, over strategy. But it was not so much an economic confrontation. It was not so much an economic issue. America did not depend on the Soviet Union for any economic interests. Today, that is not the case. We may have big differences with China, but we are also linked with China on the economic front. Almost every major country has an economic relationship with China. The conversations about reshoring, relocation, altering the supply chain are conversations that take place, but I sometimes wonder whether they're practical, whether they are cost effective. I just wonder whether Indian companies can just walk out of China. Will it be cost competitive? So there are so many issues that I think that have not got answered, that are not answered. And we simply cannot look at India-China through a binary lens. And that's why I think your book and the way that Tino sort of introduced it is so important. It's a multi-dimensional book, and will allow all of us, the reader, to actually look at China, look at the issues, the challenges that India faces through a multiple lenses. It won't be just a black and white sort of analysis. It's going to be a nuanced analysis. And that's one reason why I think your book is going to be an exceedingly important contributor to the understanding of the relationship between India and China. Let me not take up more of the time, but I do want to end my my introductory remarks with a personal anecdote. You know, you're a journalist, Ananth. Had you interviewed me for your book, I might have regaled you with stories about how, as a young, literally as a 10-year-old, I sort of ran around the house in Beijing when my father was posted there, playing sort of hide and seek with the 8-9 Chinese spies that had been planted in our house. But that's not the story I want to narrate today. I want to tell you about a story that I hope will interest you because you're a journalist, and it might even interest Nirupama and Shankar, because they were both ambassadors to China, and they may even know the person I'm about to talk about. So 20 years on, 1983, 84, I was posted in America. I was working for an American oil company called Phillips Petroleum. And I had been posted to their head office, which was in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Now, Oklahoma is the heartland of Red America, the heartland of evangelical America. In that little village of Bartlesville of 30,000 people, there were 110 Baptist churches. And I was, an Indian, and not a red Indian, an Indian, who was literally in a minority of one. Anyway, my job at that time was in some part responsible for the Far East. And so I used to read the papers, and anything concerned with China and in America caught my eye. Now, around that time, Nixon and Mao had reestablished diplomatic relations, and the first Chinese ambassador to America landed in Washington, D.C. Amidst a blaze of publicity. Every newspaper carried headlines about this man, and I read the name, and something struck within me. A memory was triggered. I called my father, and I discovered that this man, his name is Chang Wen-chen. The pronunciation is obviously different. Had been the man who had sat across my father for 6 months when, in 1959, when the two of them and their colleagues were negotiating, or were endeavoring, you might say, to persuade each other about the veracity, about the solidity of the border claims that each country had put forward. And these two men had talked for 6 months in 3 different cities, Beijing, Rangoon, and in Delhi. Anyway, I wrote to Chang Wen-cheng and just introduced myself. I was in Oklahoma, he was in Washington. And because I had this locus standi to, I invited him to Oklahoma. I never expected a reply. But I can only say that not only did I get a reply, he also accepted my invitation. And so he was the first state that he visited as the first ambassador to China was Oklahoma. And his host was an Indian. And I, for one day, was literally on front pages of the Oklahoma Times and God knows which other papers. Until then, no one had cared about me. No one was in the least bit interested about who this Indian was. But then I became the person who brought the Chinese ambassador, the first Chinese ambassador to the state. And that's what really was the story I wanted to narrate. But I'll conclude by saying that he wrote me a letter which was warm, I still have it, and it really established the human dimension to every international negotiation, every international issue. And I just hope and pray that the conversations that we are having today on the border will have interlocutors who have the same warmth and human dimension to them. So anyway, thank you, Tinu, thank you, Ananth, thank you, everyone. And it's a great pleasure to host you all.
Thank you, Vikram, for those remarks. And I think those human, personal observations on your experience. In fact, I recommend Vikram has 2 pieces in the Indian Express over the last 2 or 3 months, one about his father and the time in Beijing, and one about the economic dimension in India-China relations and how that is being affected by the current standoff. Thank you, Vikram. So I think I'll introduce the speakers one by one. Let me start by Ananth, and maybe then we'll come to each of the speakers for the first round. But Ananth, let's start with you because you're really the star here today. You brought us this book, and you have the ungrateful task now of, in 5 to 10 minutes, explain to us, and to those that haven't read the book, we all have read it, but to those who may not have read the book and are maybe interested in the book, what you really tried to achieve with this book and what the main messages are of this book. For those that don't know Ananth, Ananth Krishnan is a former visiting fellow at Brookings, India, CSEP, as I had mentioned before. He's currently a journalist with The Hindu, and previously he served as China Bureau Chief and Associate Editor for the India Today group based out of Beijing between 2009 and 18. Krishnan reported out of China for over a decade for India Today and The Hindu. His reporting is focused on China's relations with India, Chinese neighborhood diplomacy, but also Chinese domestic politics and its economy. Ananth, over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Tino, and thank you, Vikram, as well, for your very warm remarks. And more than that, also for giving me this great platform in 2019 with CSEP, then Brookings India, which was when I actually started work on this book. And it was really a great platform for me just after I moved back to India, after reporting from China for 9 years, to just pause, kind of try and take a breath and make sense of everything that I'd seen over those 10 years. And I think that was the process that resulted in this book. And thank you so much to Ambassador Rao, Ambassador Menon, and Professor Chen as well for making the time to be here today. So what I'll do, as Tino said, is try in 5 minutes to try and sum up what I was working on for, I guess, 10 plus 2 years. Of course, I think being in China over the past decade, needless to say, it was a very eventful decade. I first moved to China actually just after the Olympics, when I went to try and learn Mandarin. And I think that when I first moved, it seemed like a time of great openness in China. I think not just for the foreign media, but for domestic media as well. Coinciding with the Olympics, a lot of restrictions were removed. As a foreign journalist, you could actually travel to any province except for Tibet without prior permission. And all this was very new at the time. And I think there was this feeling, I would say a feeling of inevitability that China would continue on this path of opening up. And I don't mean economically here, but politically as well, of course, within the limits that the Communist Party would find acceptable. But I think that though we felt we were heading somewhere, those of us who were there at the time, I think, of course, in hindsight, all of that turned out to be upended in many ways in November 2012, which was when Xi Jinping took over. And I think in hindsight, that turns out to be such a transformative moment, I think, both for developments within China politically, but also I think in how China saw its relations with the world and with India as well. And I think it's natural for anyone who lived in China at the time to keep going back to that moment and trying to make sense of it, which I think we all still are trying to do. And what I try and do in this book is look at the last 10 years as I experienced them, China's internal political, economic, social changes. So I think at the outset, I should say it's more a China book rather than an India-China book. Though, of course, my broader aim is to try and explain how all these developments matter to us in India and how these developments impacted relations with India as well, which is a question that I try and keep coming back to in the book. So I should also say it's more a on-the-ground perspective of a reporter rather than a scholarly book or a IR book. And it's, I think, mostly informed by interviews with people that I came to meet and know in China. So the other aim that I hope to achieve is to try and present a multitude of Chinese voices to give a sense of how people in China try and make sense of all these changes that they've been witnessing the last few years. So very briefly, just to kind of outline how the book is structured, it's organized into 6 parts, each of which explores a different dimension of China. And I argue in the book that India faces a 4-fold China challenge, which the first 4 parts of the book address. I think the first and foremost one is the political challenge of dealing with China, dealing with a one-party state that in some ways I think is looking to increasingly shape global institutions in line with its own values. And I think to ask the question what those values are, it's something more important than ever to pay attention to that, which is the focus of part 1, which looks at the legacy that Mao Zedong left behind, what Xi Jinping inherited, and how he has left his imprint in changing how China governs itself. I think the debate about the China model after the pandemic has been getting only sharper, and I think in a strange way, reinforcing views rather than changing them. I think for many people in China, the way China emerged from COVID has revalidated their views on the strengths of their system. But I think for many people abroad, the initial failures in dealing with the outbreak in Wuhan, I think has perhaps reinforced their view of the inherent weaknesses of the system. I think the second challenge that I identify in the book is the economic challenge, which is both learning from China's growth story and also navigating this increasingly lopsided trading relationship. I try and outline how the India-China trade and investment relationship has changed a lot in the last few years, coinciding with 2 big trends: the big surge in outward Chinese investment, I think starting around 2013, and also the rise of China as an innovating power, which is something that I think many people were skeptical of. But both these developments have impacted relations with India in a big way, in the way Chinese tech companies, for example, have come to India, invested in acquiring stakes in Indian companies. And these were issues, I think, that were going on for the last few years, but didn't really get all that attention until this summer's events on the boundary, which we can talk about later. I think the third challenge that I outline is the diplomatic and, of course, military challenge of managing the unresolved border and a bilateral relationship that has always had this very delicate balance of working together and of cooperation and confrontation, and asking the question, is that balance tilting? I try and look at China's changing worldview and ask what that means for the China-India relationship. I think that most of us would agree that over the past 3-4 decades, both countries have probably done remarkably well in carrying on this very difficult dance of cooperating and competing. But I think a lot of this cooperation, to some degree, especially on global issues, was predicated on this somewhat shared understanding of the world order, of the idea that both of them had a common desire, for instance, for developing countries to have a larger voice. But I think with China's changing view of the world, especially under Xi, and the sense of the rejuvenation of China and of the Chinese dream, which is Xi Jinping's signature campaign slogan, is that logic now getting diluted? Is a question that I try and explore. I think finally, what I found most interesting writing this book was the challenge of history. I think perhaps it's the most ignored challenge in some way, but the one that I find most captivating in terms of dealing with the history of the boundary question and the memory of 1962 as well. I try and be as objective as I guess one can be in this very emotive issue in looking at the origins of the war, the actions of both sides in the lead up to 1962, the origins of the boundary dispute, and arguing why, in light of this summer's events, I think that settling the boundary is something that perhaps we need to discuss more openly, have a national conversation about, and perhaps discuss it less emotively as well, if that's ever possible. The fifth part of the book looks at China's frontiers based on several trips that I made to Tibet, Xinjiang, and 4 months that I lived in Hong Kong in 2019, which coincided with the protest movement. And I won't say much about my time in these frontiers, but I think that it is interesting to kind of look at a very different picture of the China model from these areas, in some ways a less resilient picture of the China model and the questions it's facing in its own backyard. I think in some, the hope of mine in writing this book is to try and present a different picture of China, to perhaps try and challenge some conventional wisdoms that we hold about the politics, the China model, the relationship as well. And I think that in some level, it was also writing this book was kind of a plea for us to pay more attention to China, especially for the media, to devote more resources in covering and understanding this country and this relationship as well. I think I will end there, Tino, and of course, I'm happy to come back to many of these issues later on in this conversation.
Thank you, Ananth. Great job at putting 400 pages into 5 minutes and these 6 parts of your book. I'll be biased, Ananth. I think what I really enjoyed in your book, and I think most people here in India, but also around the world, frankly, people who are trying to understand how India is looking at China and what's happening in China. My favorite parts are really the ones where you explore the China angle. Right? We hear so much about the Belt and Road, India-China relations, the foreign policy and strategy angle, but your parts on the politics in particular, I mean, you arrived in 2009, so the 9 to 12 period is fascinating. The stories you bring out about the battle of ideas that really never took place, right? The fake battle of ideas that was cut short with Xi Jinping's rise in 2012. The part on the economy, your visits to understand the manufacturing miracle, the urbanization processes, the technology part of it, the whole sort of controlling state, and then your visits to the frontier provinces, and then finally these 6 fabulous vignettes of personal stories of 6 people and looking at India-China relations to those 6 people. I think these are really this is really the added value of your book, and allowed me to understand a bit more about this fascinating country, China. Good, so I'll pass on to the panel now, and for a first round to let our panelists comment a bit about the book and give their own impressions and about this book. I'll start with Ambassador Jaishankar Menon. If I may quickly and briefly introduce him, Ambassador Jaishankar Menon is Distinguished Fellow with us at CSEP, also visiting professor at Ashoka University. His long career in public service spans diplomacy, national security, atomic energy, disarmament policy, and India's foreign policy relations with many different powers around the world. Ambassador Menon served as National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India between 2010 and 2014, also as Foreign Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs between 2006 and 2009. He served as India's ambassador to China and Israel, also the High Commission to Pakistan and Sri Lanka. As ambassador to China, he restored relations following India's nuclear weapons tests of '98. And between '92 and '95, Ambassador Menon also negotiated the first boundary-related agreement between India and China. He also served as a special representative of the Prime Minister of India on the India-China boundary issue between 2010 and 14. Currently, he's also the chairman of the advisory board of the Institute of Chinese Studies here in Delhi. He's the author of Choices Inside the Making of Indian Foreign Policy, and also the author of an upcoming book on India and Asian geopolitics out in a few months. Ambassador Menon, up to you.
Thank you, Tino, and thank you for that very flattering introduction. Thank you also, Ananth, for giving us this opportunity to not just read your book, but to comment on really what is a wonderful book, not just on China, but on India, China as well. You're very modest in the way you present it. You know, for anyone who's lived in China, your motivation in writing the book, as you describe it, is a familiar feeling where you say that the China you hear about in India is nothing like the China that you've actually experienced. And this is really why your book is so valuable, because it offers a portrait of China's complexity and development that is much more than just the media trope of a militarized security state out to establish world domination. And you've actually included much more. It's social complexity, the diversity of opinion in China that strikes anyone who actually lives there and speaks the language. And I think you were lucky. You had very good timing. You went at a time when China was at its, relatively speaking, at least its most open, not the closed, ideologically tight, security-obsessed party state that we see today. And frankly, I mean, to be able to meet people like Yang Jisheng, Mao Zedong, and so on, I mean, that certainly of, how do you describe it, of non-official persuasions. I mean, that I don't think is easy or possible anymore. But it's a tribute to your energy and to your dedication and your professionalism that you did so. Not only meeting people like this, but also accessing the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives for the brief period when they were relatively open. I mean, many of those papers were later taken back, redacted. I think you did an amazing job in looking. You've traveled through most of China. So really the picture of China that you paint, I cannot think of another Indian who has done this or done it in such detail. I found it very insightful on several levels. When, for instance, when you argue that BRI has taken China away from the market to the SOEs, at least reform, for instance, when you describe how China uses her history. So there I might have some arguments with you. Or you also say how different Chinese Laokai is from the Soviet Gulag, for instance. And because people bring all these assumptions about China, and I think what you've done is really to change that view. So I therefore think that the more people who read it, the better. what I found particularly fascinating was your bit on ideology, on the new left in China, which must now, I think, include Xi Jinping. You know, the ideology, the role of the party, SOEs, and so on. But more than that, for me, the second great value of the book is that it's by an Indian, from an Indian point of view, but does not overdo the comparison between India and China. Because the fact is, these are two increasingly different societies and economies, and our paths are diverging and have been now for some years, certainly during the period that you were in China, reporting on China. But your book doesn't fall into the other trope, which we see in the Indian media at least, of sort of breastbeating, moaning, whining about, you know, the growing gap, etc. And here again, your book is full of insights, comparing corruption in China, wholesale, and corruption in India, which is retail. And I mean, a whole set of insights like this, which I really, in my experience, and this is where I see the value of your book, the Indian image of China takes about 10 to 15 years to catch up with Chinese reality. And the trouble is, of course, both India and China are changing so fast. China has changed, you know, really fast. So 10 years or 15 years is a very long time. You get completely out of touch with reality, with what you're actually dealing with. So that's where the value of your book is. This is an accurate, acute account of where China is today. And as China gets more ambitious, more nationalistic, views itself as a regional, well, hegemon, I suppose, that the consequences for the India-China relationship, the subcontinent, the Indian Ocean region, are increasingly evident. And that you examine very well. I think the chapters on India-China relations are well worth reading because they trace the history, the recent developments as well, and go a long way towards explaining why there is this present crisis in the relationship, especially when you trace the eroding convergence between India and China, which has changed the strategic framework. There was a strategic framework from 1988 onwards, which kept the peace broadly and enabled both of us to go about developing ourselves. But that relationship, that framework has obviously broken down. I actually was wondering when I read your account of the Modi-Xi meeting in Astana just before the Doklam crisis in 2017, whether we missed the warning signs when Xi Jinping told Modi that after their many meetings, he felt he hardly knew Modi. Now that's quite a statement, actually. After meeting somebody many times, when you say, I don't understand you, either you're saying, you know, what the hell are you up to? Or you're saying, I want to get closer to you. I really need to understand you. I mean, you could put positive spin on it, but negatives. Or else you're saying, I'm about to test you and to find out what you're really about. So 2 out of 3 possibilities are not very good possibilities. But that's what I like about the book. There's solid reporting on which one can then actually see, and with 2020 hindsight, maybe the book actually explains to a great extent how we have come to where we are today. In any case, as China pushes out and seeks to build a China-centric order in Asia, China-US relations get more contentious. India and also Pakistan have been pushed up the Chinese priority list. And I think you look at all 3 of the triangles that really matter: India, China, US, India, Pakistan, China, India, Russia, China. But I think you're very careful not to predict the future. I don't agree with everything you say in the book. You say that a public reckoning in India for 62 is essential for a boundary settlement. Or you also say somewhere, I think, that China wants peace in J&K. But these are matters of detail. But I have one big grouse. There's no index. And that actually hampers the New Delhi read, which starts at the index and works its way backwards. Because this is a serious book about a serious subject, and it really should take itself seriously and produce it. But overall, I must say, I really enjoyed the book. No one knows how this never-ending story will play itself out. because we are at a moment of great uncertainty, but you've produced a book because its strength is that it's descriptive rather than prescriptive, and encourages us to keep an open mind. You've produced a book that I think is very valuable at this time. And as Tino said, most of all, this is a readable book. You have the great advantage of never having worked in government or a corporation.
Or in academia.
And you can therefore still express yourself clearly without jargon. And I think the portraits at the end are really most useful in breaking the stereotypes that still pervade foreign commentary on China and India-China. So thank you, Ananth. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. I can't resist, with Ambassador Rao's permission, just a very quick 1-minute question for you, Ananth, on this 2009, 8, 9 period to 12 period. I sense a lot of the early chapters and most of the chapters were written in that period, or it seems like, you know, you're meeting students of Tsinghua University and talking about Tiananmen with them, right? There's fabulous little stories of how you meet a variety of dissidents and critical people in Taiwan, but also in Hong Kong and in Beijing itself. Would you be able to do that today? Just tell us very quickly, would you be able to do that same type of reportage over the last 2-3 years?
I don't think so, Tino. And I should just thank Ambassador Menon, first of all, for his very kind remarks. But I think you're absolutely right. And it's become a lot harder to do that kind of reporting now. And even though because I've been reporting on the border crisis from India, just a small example, some of the Chinese strategic scholars that opened up to me in the book, even about the boundary and about the future, are people that are reluctant to talk today. So I think there's been such a change in atmosphere and climate, which I think is one reason why the reporting is as it is. It seemed to be two Chinas, I think, in hindsight, the one that I first moved to and then the one that I left.
Interesting. I'm sure there's more. I mean, your book actually says there's a diversity of Chinas out there, but certainly on the political front, given the end of this sort of timid liberalization period in 2000s at least, and the personalization of power in many ways, which you describe around Xi Jinping, there's certainly a new China emerging. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Nirupama Rao. She's here with us, and she's been sharing a lot of her deep expertise on China over the last few months, where she's been in high demand. And thank you for making time to join us, Ambassador Rao, who's a retired Indian diplomat and former Foreign Secretary of India between 2009 and 2011. In fact, she succeeded Ambassador Menon in 2009. Ambassador Rao joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1973. During her 4-decade-long career, she held several important assignments. First woman spokesperson in the Ministry of External Affairs, the first woman High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, the first Indian woman ambassador to China. And she also served, of course, as the India ambassador to the United States between 2011 and 2013. After her retirement, Ambassador Rao entered the world of academics, taught at various universities, including Brown University and Columbia University in the United States. She's also pursued her passion for music, setting up a wonderful Bangalore-based trust called the South Asian Symphony Foundation that furthers the cause of peace and mutual understanding and cooperation in South Asia through the medium of music. But she's here, we'll come to the region, but she's here above all for her experience in and on China. Ambassador Rao, if you could share your comments about the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Tino, and thank you for this opportunity to join this very distinguished panel to discuss Ananth's book. And congratulations, Ananth, on this wonderful book, which I have read with great interest. And it's truly, as Shankar just said, a work that deserves the highest commendation and extremely useful. I sincerely believe that this is a book that needs to be translated into a number of Indian languages so that people, in the hinterland, all our young people, our demographic dividend, will be able to read it and to form impressions of China that are based on a rational understanding of that country, which I believe you try to transmit through this book. I remember the first time I met you, Ananth, it was in Beijing. I think it was perhaps late 2008 or early 2009. I'm not sure of the exact time here. but you had just come to China, and what a sojourn. Profound account of your years in China. And for me, it was like watching an IMAX film being swept up in the movement of your narrative, a completely absorbing experience. And in recent times, I can only produced this kind of work. I remember Evan Osnos had this book on the age of ambition based on his time working, and the Australian journalist book on China's communist rules. But as far as India is concerned, I'm wrong. I don't believe there has been any other work except 5 years based on her time as correspondent in Beijing. Going a little further back, there was Frank Moraes. He wrote a book, Report on Mao's China, and one called.
So we seem to have lost Ambassador Rao. Connection was a bit spotty, so hopefully she'll rejoin us.
Lost the connection.
Oh, there you are. Yes, yeah.
You just
Please.
lost it temporarily. So this is really special. And to quote Moraes, he once tried to distinguish between the Indian and Chinese mind. And this is what he had to say. Although the Indian mind is often convoluted and sometimes enigmatic, it lacks the curious combination of realism and elusiveness that distinguishes the Chinese mind. The Chinese mind is more nimble than the Indians, gayer, less sensitive, but more practical. Without being fanciful, it likes to express itself in imagery and illustration, and the habit of building up an argument through suggestion rather than statement gives conversation with a cultivated Chinese a curiously evanescent, will-o'-the-wisp quality. It is like Huang Chuan, who painted in the boneless way, disdaining to imprison his landscapes, flowers, and birds within a drawn outline. And I believe in some senses, Ananth, while retaining your intrinsic Indianness and you're a very authentic Indian voice, but you've also learnt the art of painting your pictures on China in a free and yet realistic and pragmatic way, and also in a manner full of imagery and illustration, humanistic, and disdaining, and this is very important, disdaining to imprison your landscapes. And for that, I congratulate you. Shankar has already spoken about, the qualities that make your book special, and I can hardly improve upon him and his perceptive analysis. But let me just say briefly that what stood out for me in the book were your descriptions on Tibet, on Xinjiang, your analysis of the motivations behind the Belt and Road Initiative. I found your description of the border town of Yadung in the Chumbi Valley most interesting, and especially, your reference to the fact that this being a small, muddy, and underwhelming frontier outpost, in a sense, presented a perfect snapshot of the India-China relationship. I'm not sure if I can entirely agree with you about that, but I can see where you're coming from. And the fact that there are, despite the strategic framework that we built in this relationship from 1988, as Ambassador Menon pointed out, there were many areas that I believe didn't really flower, didn't really evolve, didn't really attain their true potential. And now, of course, the future is quite uncertain. We really don't know what it will bring for this relationship post Galwan and the standoff along the line of actual control. Your reference to Chinese investment in India, very interestingly, as having begun to emerge as a new factor of stability in the relationship. And then how you tell your readers how you can learn from how reform in China succeeded. And here the comparison with India really stands out. And you speak about how the investments in health and education and the building of human capital really helped, apart from the skilling, plus the physical infrastructure that was built up, but the importance that you place on human capital. That's why I would like this book to be read everywhere in India, across the language barriers, so that people really understand China much more perceptibly and much less in that manner that many of our television channels seek to put across when you hear the discussions currently on the relationship with China. Another point that you made was about scholarship in China on India, especially when you speak about the Sanskrit manuscripts that were found at the Potala Palace in Lhasa, and the fact that many Chinese scholars of these manuscripts find it difficult to do research in India. This was something that the Nalanda University could certainly have shepherded and certainly could have piloted, but that has not quite happened. And many other countries are partnering with China to take these studies and this very profound building of profound understanding of ancient India and ancient India-China relations forward. I'm reminded of what one of the first scholars in India on China, the professor, I think it was Professor Biswas, correct me if I'm wrong. He wrote this book on India and China. And he speaks about the future of India being, the present in India-China relations being very small, and that you have to look to the future. Well, I hope that smallness that defines the present will not define the future. Then the other, Ambassador Menon also mentioned this about the sections of your book on the border question, on the boundary question between India and China, and the hard reality of the two-front situation involving China and Pakistan. I often say, that we have a three-body problem, whether it's China, US, India, or whether it's China, Pakistan, India, to bring a metaphor out from the world of physics. But we have these three-body problems in our relationship with China. But on the boundary question, I think your words could not have struck a truer and more relevant note when you speak of history standing in the way of a solution. And here I'd like to actually quote from what you said. History still stands in the way of a solution. As I see it, a resolution would only be possible if there is a public reckoning in India of both the history of the boundary dispute and the events that led to war, including an introspection of its own actions that led to 1962, beyond the simplistic narrative that continues to maintain a tight grip over public imagination. Now, this is something that we could debate, but certainly the politics of history and the politics of memory, I believe, really need to be dissected very closely. And therefore, chapter 14 of the book, I think, is a must read. But I just remembered the name of the China expert I was speaking of. It's Professor P.C. Bagchi. Sorry, I said Biswas. It was Professor P.C. Bagchi. He was the Vice Chancellor of Shantiniketan Vishwabharati when he died in 1956. Now, talking of memory, your book really brought back a flood of memory as far as my own experiences in China were concerned, starting from 1984. I think of the years when we had droves of Chinese delegations visiting India to study what we were doing, whether it was in planning or whether it was in agriculture or the management of the civil service or in the exploration of outer space or in science and technology administration. What a difference, what an era that was more than 30 years ago when China sought to learn from India, when they were just beginning their process of reform and opening up. I remember the days of 1986 when Sundarong Chu burst upon us, and my first visits to Tibet at that time, to Kailash and Mansarovar. I remember the visit of Rajiv Gandhi in 1988, a visit to the border areas in 1989, all these areas that we speak of in the Western sector today. Staying at at a village in China in 1990 when our Deputy Prime Minister Devi Lal was visiting China, and I saw at first hand what a village and township enterprise looked like. A visit to Xinjiang in 1991 when Urumqi was just a Soviet Potemkin-looking town, and how things had changed when I went back in 2007, what a difference the city had transformed itself. But then I also recall a visit to Kashgar, which you write about so beautifully in your book. That has also completely changed. I believe the old quarter has been demolished, but I remember seeing the building that housed our consulate in Kashgar, which the Chinese did not allow us to operate after 1949. I remember this President Jaishankar and China having a nuclear test during that visit, which really cast a long shadow over it. And also the Chinese Pudong, just outside Shanghai, it was just beginning to develop it. And a visit of Lipang in 1991 when Tibetan protests completely took over the visit and Lipang refused to stir out of Rashtrapati Bhavan. I remember working on the first draft of the Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement in 1993, just as I handed over charge as Joint Secretary East Asia to Shankar, who took over from me. The setting up of the special representatives in 2003 and attended first draft representatives talks in Beijing in 2003. And then my own ambassadorship in China, the earthquake, meetings for the film, and the long conversation that he had with Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, who was visiting Beijing, and his being on the subject of religion for a very, very long time during the course of that session. And then, of course, my stint as Foreign Secretary. So, there was this coalescence with your book of my own memories of my being in China, a long association stretching back more than 3 decades, which defined both my professional and in many ways my personal life also in a very indelible manner. So thank you, Ananth, for making all that possible through the reading of your book. And once again, I'm so happy to be here. Congratulations. And I wish you had an index, just like Shankar said. I do wish you had an index to the book, but maybe that can be corrected in a forthcoming edition. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Ambassador Rao, for your insights and comments on the book. In fact, so for HarperCollins, there's already 2 requests, a good index and multiple translations into Indian languages, which I think is an excellent suggestion to take China into, the vernacular Indias out there that often have the most stereotypical images of China, as you describe in your book, Ananth, and certainly would certainly benefit a lot from your reporting on China. But on this, Ananth, very quickly, if I can come to again a 1-minute question to you. You speak about the 4 reporters that India has in China, and you compare it to smaller European countries that have greater media coverage of China than this great India looking at China next door. You speak about sort of this lost in translation. I mean, you have this beautiful vignette on the translator of Rabindranath Tagore, I think Fen Tang, I think, in chapter 21. And it's really a chapter on this loss in translation between both countries. Do you see things changing, Ananth, or has these last 5 months reduced again your hope? Because I saw the last 2-3 years some changes. There's younger scholars in India doing good work on China. There's a real new community at various think tanks, universities, at Jindal, at Ashoka, who are doing great work on China. But do you fear that what's happened over the last 5 months may take us back?
I think that's a good question, and I think it's a mixed picture. I think you're right that there's a lot of young scholars doing really interesting work, which is a good thing. And I met a few of them who are on fellowships, whether in Peking University or Tsinghua University. That's the good side. There are 25,000 Indian students in China, although most of them are studying medicine and often live a very cloistered academic lives. So they really don't get the opportunity that other students get, but it's still a positive. On the negative side, I think the media, I think we really have to introspect throughout this entire crisis of 2020. There were only 2 permanent Indian reporters based in Beijing for PTI and the Hindustan Times. And I think that's just a small example of how we really haven't invested enough. I think we've been confronting 2 huge crises that had immediate impacts on India, with the outbreak in Wuhan in December, and then the boundary situation as well in April. And we did not have anyone on the ground in China, barring 2 people who were actually there reporting what was happening, which to me was a great tragedy. But I think it's not a China problem. I think it's a structural media problem, where we really, the whole practice of sending people out into the field, even in India, has diminished. So on that count, I'm not very optimistic, I'm afraid, in that changing.
Thank you, Ananth, for that. Let me move on to our third panelist, who's joining us all the way from Hong Kong, Professor Zivu Chen. If I may briefly introduce you before coming to your remarks, Professor Chen is a director of the Asia Global Institute and the chair and professor of finance, and Victor and William Fung Professor in Economics at the University of Hong Kong, HKU. Professor Chen is a former professor of finance at Yale University in the United States between 1999 and 2017. He's moved to Hong Kong in 2017, and his research covers finance theory, the sociology of finance, economic history, emerging markets, as well as China's economy and capital markets. He was also a visiting professor at Peking University, the School of Economics, and Tsinghua University, the School of Social Sciences. He successfully led efforts to construct historical, financial, and social databases from China's historical archives, and has written on Chinese economics and social topics. Professor Chen, up to you on Ananth's book.
Thank you, Constantino. First of all, let me thank the Center for Social and Economic Progress for giving me this great opportunity to talk about Ananth's book. As I mentioned in the conversation we had, I've been a big fan of Ananth since I first met him, partly because of some biased personal background, especially once I learned that his wife is from the same province as I'm from. Right away, we felt so much closeness to each other. But putting that personal side on the side, I have to say that if there's anyone I can think of to write a book to try to bridge the gap in understanding between India and China, Ananth definitely would be one of the few. Not only his experience has been so great in covering China and in knowing about the Chinese people very intimately. As I often like to mention, he has been to my hometown province, Hunan, many more times than I have over the last 10 years. So that tells you, what firsthand knowledge Ananth has gained in multiple dimensions. And on the other hand, given all the news headlines from the US, from American media, European media, as also probably, as I can imagine, from the Indian media, it should be very easy for many people, including Indian people, to be very scared and very negative about the future of India-China relations, maybe even very pessimistic about the future of humanity. But I have to say that given how wonderful as a writer Ananth is, and also his first-hand knowledge, there are much more commonalities between India and China. When I say commonalities, I really mean by between the Indian people and the Chinese people. As I often like to say, when I was at Yale as a professor for something like 18 years, most of my closest colleagues on the Yale campus are from India, and I've never found any difficulty in becoming very close friends with my Indian colleagues or Indian students, as well as others that I run into at conferences. But I think over the last 3 years, especially, I've made something like 12 trips to India. But the more I do this, the more I realize the missing communication and understanding between Indian people and Chinese people. So for someone like me, I like to look at a much longer term trends than just the moments, conflicts or issues that may seem to be dividing the two countries. So this is why the Doklam conflict and other things may easily make us lose sight about the many dimensions of commonality between the two countries. Because otherwise, I would imagine how difficult it would be for Ananth to get along with his wife, right? The fact that they're so close and they share, I mean, maybe Ananth, I should not mention too many details here. Huh? So the first point I want to highlight is to not forget about the commonalities between our two countries, and try to remind ourselves that the moment's headlines should be, in many cases, very temporary, and rationality will still come back to drive the processes of societies and relations between India and China. A second point I would like to mention is more specifically from Ananth's book. I can give many examples, but one example I want to highlight is in his chapter 3, A Battle of Ideas. Especially today, it's very easy to let us forget the complicated picture of the political landscape in China. So in chapter 3, Ananth talks about Hu Deping as an example. He's the eldest son of the former, one of my favorite former CCP party general secretaries, so Hu Yaobang. And Hu Deping has been one of the proponents for liberal democracy type of developments in China. The reason that I want to mention this is that it's very easy to forget that there are multiple groups of people or communities of people, instead of just one China with one political view or one political vision for how the country should be. I want to mention this partly because it has been very easy over the last few years for Americans and even Europeans to say that the engagement policy the US and Western countries have had with China has been a big failure and so on. Personally, I think if we would actually pay attention to the different forces that have been at play in China, then we should not draw the conclusion too easily that the engagement policy has totally failed, because some of the tactical details or the specific reform policies in China and also by the US have played sometimes very big roles in determining the outcome of the reform process, as well as the engagement policy by the US and other countries. Anyway, I should not take too much time getting into a lot of the details, but that's just one example I want to highlight to allow us to understand why the engagement policy itself may not have been a failure, but the reform approach that has been taken may have contributed more to the failure of in terms of delivering the desired outcome. A third point I want to highlight is this is actually from Ananth's book, chapters 4 and 5. So chapter 4 talks about the manufacturing miracle. Of course, everyone has read a lot about the manufacturing maturization process in China. But chapter 5 is devoted to the urbanization experience China has had. As you know, these are the things that I think India can really learn quite a bit from China about, because when we are confronted with many headlines and especially the ongoing conflict, that we may actually tend to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So what India can learn from the economic development models or strategies, especially in the whole urbanization process. So India can definitely gain more from that side. So that is something the book devotes a lot of space and time to in a very wonderful way. So that's the third point I want to bring up. And then the last point, in the interest of time, is that the political landscape or the political system in China, for those of us who are interested in knowing, what may happen down the road a few years from now or a decade from now, is the embedded risk of the one-party state system in China. Just to make it more concrete. So chapter 2 of Ananth's book is devoted to the rise of the current leader in China. So I think once we pay attention to the details of what Ananth has written about the rise of the current leader and also about the one-party state, then we can see that there is a lot of embedded big political risk. For one thing, I've personally studied how succession in Chinese history was done from one emperor to another and so on. In over the last 2,000 years in Chinese history, many emperors were killed, or such transition times often led to very chaotic situations. So Deng Xiaoping did a good job in making the succession less unknown, less uncertain by introducing, the system of the current leader picking the leader for the next generation, not for the immediate generation. So that system worked to really make the political succession very stable. But I hope that the party in China can actually work out a better plan so that succession will no longer be, such a very scary risk for the whole 1.4 billion Chinese people to have to experience. But for those of us, especially for policymakers in India, so learning more about the delicate details of the system can help India position properly for the embedded risk in the current political system. Anyway, let me just stop here. So it's so as I mentioned at the beginning, Ananth has done such a wonderful job. When he first mentioned that he he was working on this book, my immediate reaction was he is the right person to really do this at the right time, as the two ambassadors earlier also mentioned. So I would highly recommend this book to everyone in India or other countries who wants to understand today's China better.
Thank you, Professor Chen. So I think we have maybe another, I mean, we officially have another 11 minutes, but if with your permission, we'll take it maybe to 20 minutes till 6:10, and we'll do what I enjoy doing very much. Ambassador Menon has done it before, which is a rapid fire with a lot of great questions we have to all of you. Very specific one. The only request I have to use, you could keep your answers very short so we can cover a variety of topics and issues. And I'll come to each of you and just please keep it short to a minute. I know it's very difficult, but it'll be, I think, an interesting sort of tour de table on a lot of issues in the book that remain to be discussed. Ananth, let me just start with you following up on Professor Chen. Two things. One is what we discussed of the discipline and decentralization of power in China. What you describe is actually not a one-party state. I think there's formally 4 parties, I think, sort of 4 or 3 or 4 extra mock parties. And you describe also the Congress, right? And the discussions at the lower and upper house that were sort of escape valves for some opposition to come out. Post-COVID, are we returning to that or not, would you say? And this is your epilogue, which really discusses the discontent that is brewing in Chinese society. You say it's both the strength and the weakness of the party that is coming out post-COVID, but can it really be both? Or are we seeing an inability of the party to absorb this discontent?
I think, Tino, I think the signs are clear that post-COVID, it's moving in one direction, which is towards greater control, greater centralization. I think the party felt it was under pressure. It seems a long time ago, but in December and January, I happened to be in Beijing at the time, and there were searching questions of the leadership then as to why they hadn't reacted in a better way for an entire month in Wuhan. But now, of course, the whole narrative has changed, showcasing that China has overcome this virus while the rest of the world, and in particular India and the US, haven't. But I think that starting early this year, it's very clear that to me, it was only reinforcing trends that we were already seeing in China under Xi Jinping, which was towards greater control, greater centralization. And I think if you've looked at even some of the changes in policy or some of the announcements that we've seen from the party leadership in the last few months, I think the signs are very clear, especially because we're looking towards the next great big event, which is the 100th anniversary of the party in July 2021, and then the next big Congress in 2022. So if I had to put money on anything, I think that it's only going to be in the direction of more tightening and not less.
Ananth, let me follow up on that. You speak about 4 different topics in your book and sort of hint at comparisons with India. You speak about the manufacturing miracle, the economic miracle of the, well, however you want to see it, late 70s, 80s, or post 90s. You speak about urbanization and the great migration of labor and the greater skilling of labor. You speak about pollution, a very nice chapter on how the state has dealt with pollution in Beijing in particular, and on infrastructure. But on all of these, you actually dismiss the idea that it's been a centralized state, a top-down approach that has been the ingredient to success in managing these 4 issues. You actually suggest 2 things repeatedly in the book. 1, decentralization, autonomy. You actually say that a mayor of a Chinese city has tremendous executive powers compared to Indian municipal and local authorities, despite being a democracy. And the second thing you suggest that worked, besides decentralization and autonomy at the provincial level, is health and education, an early on investment in health and education infrastructure. This was really surprising for me because we hear the narrative that the central state, a top-down infrastructure development has been the main cause of success.
Right. It's not to entirely dismiss the power of the central system and the state, because obviously it enables things that we can't do here, especially when it comes to infrastructure. As I also mentioned in a chapter on both the winners and losers of the urbanization process. We tend to forget the losers in China as well, which I try to narrate through the story of one lady I met in Shanghai who pursues justice and fails to get justice over many years. So it's not that I'm dismissing the power of the state, but I just wanted to push back at this very simplistic understanding that everything that works in China is only because somebody in Beijing snaps his fingers and everything follows. It certainly wasn't the case, I think, in the 80s and 90s, and the way that they even carried out reforms. A lot of it was trial and error. It was not a linear process. It was much more complicated than that, and I wanted to try and bring that out. Although I guess I should add the sort of qualification that under Xi Jinping, it does seems to be reversing in the other direction in the last few years.
Thank you, Anand, for that. Ambassador Menon, if I may come to you, can we still deal with a reasonable China these days, or have you reached a tipping point? You've made the argument that, at least in discussions we've had, that it's more important than ever to engage China at the appropriate level with the appropriate instruments. But can we still deal with a reasonable China, or is China, as you had mentioned in the Astana meeting, just saying, we don't understand, we don't know Modi, we don't know India, and there's no scope for any understanding, at least the one we had hoped for in the 2000s?
Well, I don't think it's, if you start saying I'll only deal with a reasonable China, you have a problem. You have to deal with China as it is. But I think the important thing to do is to establish where your interests and their interests coincide, where if you draw a Venn diagram, you both have common interests, and whether you have commonality. As Professor Chand said, I think there are some common interests on which you can build, but you'll have to build a new framework. The old one from '88 won't work anymore. It's clear, it's broken down. So my answer to you is yes, if you approach this with an open mind, and if you're clear about your red lines and your core interests and China's core interests, and then it's something you have to work out together. You'll only know if you try.
If I may, Ambassador Menon, Anand at some point mentions or quotes a Chinese analyst saying that China has been somehow more comfortable in dealing with the BJP in government in India, and somehow the good moments were always under BJP governments. Your comments on that?
Well, I think, it's a good statement to make when the BJP is in power, one. It's not a bad statement to make even when the BJP is not in power, because it prods the UPA or whoever it is to do more. I don't take those things seriously. It's like we used to say with the US that, oh, we do better with Democrats. Then we started saying, no, we do better with Republicans. Frankly, we work with both. And we deal with the US because it's a fact of life. And it's the same thing between India and China. I don't think this is something that should be party political. I think it's India's national interest. And they might try and split you and use you, but that's their business. You do the same to them.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. Ambassador Rao, if I may come to you on a very interesting chapter, which is this China-Pakistan chapter you had mentioned also in your initial remarks, where Anand really travels up to almost the border until where he's allowed to, at least as an Indian citizen at that point. But my question to you really is, you worked also a lot on South Asia, and the chapters on the Belt and Road Initiative describe also how China has made unprecedented inroads, not only in Pakistan, but also in Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc. Do you see this as an obstacle for India to have good relations with its neighboring countries? Or in a very simplistic way, is China helping to split South Asia as we used to know it, or creating a new region?
Tino, South Asia is meant to be an integer. It's meant to be much more closely integrated among the 8 countries that constitute South Asia. I'm not talking of China as a South Asian country in this context, but I'm talking of us, within the old subcontinent as we defined it, plus Afghanistan and the Maldives, of course. So we have to really, in a sense, rework and work harder on our relationships with our neighbors in South Asia. And I'm not excluding Pakistan in this context, although, Pakistan, it seems to be a relationship that is defined by hopelessness and all the bitter recriminations that we have faced and the experiences that we've faced in the past. So I think China has, in a sense, taken advantage of the fact that our connectivity and our processes of integration within South Asia, that is India's processes of integration within South Asia, haven't been sufficiently built up. They haven't evolved in a positive manner, and China has taken advantage of that, together with the enormous resources at its command and the infrastructure advantages that it has accrued to itself over the years, whether it's with Nepal or whether it's in the maritime space as its navy has built up, in terms of the places, not bases perhaps at this moment, that it has built up in the region. And I think there are many lessons to be learned for India in that context.
Thank you, Ambassador. Professor Chen, if I may come to you in Hong Kong, I mean, one issue that you have observed very closely is something that Ananth again repeats in his book that seems to be, not surprisingly for any authoritarian country, a trade-off citizens are willing to make between economic growth and lack of freedom, right? So stability, order, on which the Chinese state has performed exceptionally well, in fact, much better than the Indian state. Should we be worried if there is a change in the economic structure of China, which we're seeing in many ways, and the limitations of the export-led growth model? Will that create resentment, more losers, more criticism and dissent in China?
I think it's a very common thing among people in almost all societies. It's part of humanity to adapt and then find some compromise or some trade-off between different objectives, so whether it's freedom of speech and many other freedoms on the one hand, and then controls, limitations on the other hand, right? So this is in particular, if we go outside India and China, if we look at the American society, is American society more freer today than 2 decades ago? Probably not. It's the opposite, right? But Americans also try to adapt and accept the new reality. I think for Chinese people, it's the same way. Of course, there are always consequences whenever one type of freedom is taken away. So this applies to Hong Kong and to the mainland Chinese people. I've heard so many business owners and executives in China complaining and getting really frustrated, or trying to move out, or having moved out of China. At the end of the day, many of them still choose to accept what they do not want to accept, and then try to find a way to re-rationalize everything internally in their own mind. So in particular, even that the Chinese government would like to say, we are much more open now for new investment and for capital flows and so on. But if you actually pay attention to the direction of free capital flow at the moment, yes, there is free capital flow into China. So when it's inward capital flow is totally free, but the capital outflow is totally unfree, right? So they try to make that kind of policies, and then all the business people, of course, first complain and then react very negatively, but then they accept the new reality and then basically reinvest everything in China. So this is why, in particular, of the last few years, as the capital outflow controls have become tighter and tighter, then the economic boom, at least in the near term, is still kind of continuing, even given the pandemic that is going on outside China, but not so much inside China. So I think in the end, the real negative consequences will take longer time to actually be more visibly seen by economists and others. Yeah.
Right. Professor Chen, if I may just follow up on the economics of the relationship and the future of the Chinese economy. 2 questions we got from participants, from Surajit Senapati and Shubhashish Sharangi, both of them asking what your position is on how India should deal with this decoupling debate. Is it possible? And this is the biggest question which is being asked. Can you keep on having China as your main trade partner and deepen the economic relationship? How do you do that if you're having growing concerns about the security, the political future of the relationship, and the technological surveillance state in China, but in generally the deterioration on the security front? What is your view from Hong Kong on that?
I think on the India-China economic relations front, I guess Ananth will probably agree with me that in some ways, for most Chinese people, they don't really have any negative view about India. So at least as far as the business community is concerned, all the people in the business community I've talked to have been very much active in looking at opportunities in India and so on. In fact, during my last trip to Goa in December 2019, I was pretty impressed. The level of economic interest, the level of interest in business ties between the two countries was visibly much higher than even 6 months or 10 months earlier when I was in New Delhi. So I thought things were going really well. That just shows that if we could put aside the geopolitical factors, the business and economic relations could actually really take off. But I understand, given what has been going on in the last few months, India should take the geopolitical factors very much into consideration. But I have to say, as of now, maybe the top few leaders, they have different considerations than the people on the ground in China have. But if you were just for the people in the business community to make a decision, to decide which way the India-China economic relations should go, I would be 98% sure that they would vote for much improved economic ties between the two countries.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Chen. Ananth, if I may come to you on this sort of similar issue, there are two questions regarding the sort of decoupling debate. We've seen India ban apps, over 100 apps, according to your count. India putting up restrictions on various investment flows in the Indian economy coming from China. Is that sustainable? I think at some point in your book, you say that this has been an illusion somehow that you can decouple from the Chinese economy and ban Chinese products. There's always been that lure. We see it more than ever over the last few months, of course. Is that possible, especially when we're talking about the tech sector, again, where there's tremendous Chinese investments from the big four companies, at least here in India?
I think that ideas that we're going to completely de-Sinicize every aspect of India's economy, I don't think that's going to happen. If you just look at the fact that, that's how the world works. There are some goods that we just can't get from elsewhere. And even if we were trying to diversify, I would say that it would probably end up getting Chinese goods from a third-party country. I think if you look at the fact that our dependence on pharmaceuticals, pharmaceutical ingredients is one clear example where we still have needed China. Even through this crisis, our imports of medical equipment have gone up. There is no visible change in our trading patterns this year. There has been a broad slump through the lockdown in March and April, but the figures that I've seen from June and July and August suggest that we're still importing in a similar way than we were 2-3 years ago. So I think that to me, there's a lot of limitations in terms of completely ending this relationship. And I think we should even ask ourselves if we want to do that. Just taking a step back briefly, I was in Beijing 2014 onwards. The Narendra Modi government had gone all out to get investment from China. It seems like another lifetime ago, but they were doing everything that they could to get investments from China. I think part of the changes in rules is perhaps reflective of a frustration that they did get investment, but not in the areas they wanted. I think they wanted investment in greenfield type projects, but what they were getting were Chinese companies coming in and investing in stakes in Indian companies. So I think that part of their motivation in April, pre-border crisis, to change the rules was to change the pattern of investment and rather than entirely decouple. So in short, I think that I don't think people realistically believe we will do so. The only comment that I would have is one problem that India has faced is it doesn't have any long-term strategy in how we want this relationship to go on the trade and investment front. For 4 or 5 years, we invested a lot in trying to boost this, as I mentioned, as a possible factor of stability. But I think soon as a boundary crisis happened, we've immediately taken action, for instance, to ban a lot of Chinese apps, even if I don't know if that's really going to deter Chinese behavior on the border. So to me, the bottom line is there has to be more coherent approach, looking more long-term, and ask the question, where do we want this relationship to go, rather than be entirely reactive, is one point that I'd make, Tina.
Thank you, Ananth. Ambassador Rao, if I may come to you. You served as India's ambassador to Washington, so no one better than you to answer this question from Harsh Shah. He's saying that the US is really retrenching itself, changing the global order. We see an America first isolationist policy, or more isolationist than ever. China's dramatic rise. And the question really would be, is you see India's proximity to the US as being adequate these days? Do you think the Indian and US need to get closer to manage China, or are we in the right direction and the right pace?
I think by and large, we followed the right direction as far as the trajectory of our relationship, India's relationship with the United States has been concerned over the last decade and a half. Of course, we have to await the outcome of the presidential election in the United States to see what further direction this relationship will take. But one outcome of the crisis in India-China relations this summer has been that most observers and most people who follow these relations, both the China relationship and the United States relationship, is that India, the alternatives left for India, I mean, it seems pretty clear, however much we practice strategic autonomy and not entering into very, very close relationships with any country, we are bound, I think, to build an even more close relationship with the United States as things go forward, unless we're able to find some middle ground in our relationship with China. And that's where this whole question of crafting the new structure that Ambassador Menon spoke about in our relations with China really comes into focus.
Thank you, Ambassador. Also, I assume that on the quadrilateral security dialogue, you would say that more needs to be done, for example, or should India be concerned about Chinese opposition and resistances?
Well, yeah, by and large, if you treat past behavior as an example, maybe we've been somewhat in the category of shrinking violets when it comes to how China may react to our relations within the Quad. But I don't believe that should be a guiding principle as we move forward. And already the way the Quad has, in a sense, reincarnated itself after 2017, it is seeking to redefine the partnerships within the Quad, whether it's bilateral, whether it's trilateral, or whether it's quadrilateral, or looking Quad plus, whether you're bringing in South Korea or New Zealand or Vietnam, as the case may be. So I think the quality of relations within the Quad is bound to be much more evolving and evolved as a result of what we are seeing in terms of China's rise in the region, China's muscularity, its assertiveness, its so-called striving for achievement and rubbing so many countries the wrong way. I believe that the Quad is, the relations that we're building within the Quad. I mean, we don't have to be just confined to the name itself, the Quad itself, but within the larger structure of a free and open Indo-Pacific, I think India is going to be increasingly drawn into relations of this nature.
Right. The Quad is in many ways only a manifestation of that, right?
Yes,
you had now New
exactly.
Zealand, Vietnam, South Korea join a Quad Plus arrangement. Yes. You have the European Union, which is sharing a lot of concerns and discussing on data privacy, on 5G, and coordinating positions with India. Right. So a whole constellation of new sort of middle powers and countries that are really trying to deal with the same challenge. Ambassador Menon, if I may come to you, you mentioned before a bit that maybe we should have learned some lessons from the recent past. I'm thinking of the summits that Ananth describes. And I think, Ananth, you sort of say, there's this going forward and backwards between 14 and 19. You had 14, 15 summits, 18, 19. The question to you, Ambassador Menon, is in an assessment of the last 6 years, has India, in particular Prime Minister Modi, in the form of these summits, been too gullible, too trusting of the Chinese? Could have this predicted? I think you mentioned something in that direction before. Yeah, you're muted.
So it seems to me you would have to have been a fly on the wall in all those 18 meetings. And the closest we have to a fly on the wall is Ananth. So I think, but I don't think you can answer that question today. You're in the middle of a crisis. And until you're past the crisis and you actually know what happened for the last 6 years, I think it would be premature to say, oh, we're gullible, failure, etc. The risk is that if India-China relations get worse, we fall back into this wonderful, convenient narrative of betrayal. It's a wonderful narrative. It has a beginning, an end. You can't accuse me of bad faith, not my fault. I'm not responsible. Put all the blame on the other side. And we've seen the power of that narrative for 62 and how it does it. So I don't think we should get into this business of who's at fault, who did what, because the immediate reaction will be defensive and will be to actually go to a narrative which will lead you to another dead end. I do think that governments of India have been risk averse in their dealings with China because of 62 and learning the wrong lessons, and because of this narrative, as Ananth points out in the book, this narrative of betrayal that we've sort of internalized across the board, across the political spectrum. It suits everybody, from the Indian Army to the Congress Party to the BJP, etc. So I'm a bit hesitant to get into this business of were we gullible, who did this, who did what, when. You don't even know. So on what basis can we jump to those judgments?
But certainly less hopeful than what Ananth describes as the beautiful Ahmedabad summit, right? Where this idea was that you could solve the strategic security border issues through economic interdependence. At least also the Chinese observers you mentioned, Ananth, come out as quite hopeful in 2014-15 that somehow, he was a reformist Prime Minister Modi. He had worked well in Gujarat with Chinese companies. And this was a very hopeful moment, right? In 2015, 14, 15.
No, I don't think anybody ever made the case that economic interdependence is going to solve our political issues with China. I mean, you look at China-US relations, here's proof that it doesn't. Look at Britain and Germany before World War I. They were the most interconnected economies. Didn't stop them going to war. I don't think anybody ever believed, not in 88, not in 2000, no, that, if we have economic interdependence, China becomes our biggest trading partner, somehow our political problems will vanish. I don't think that's the case. Nor, I think, should we think that we have sufficient economic leverage here to actually force a political conclusion. And this is true of both China and India. It's not as though you can solve your political problems through the economics of it. And I think we need to keep that distinction clear in our minds. Unless we are clear on this, we get into all kinds of woolly linkages, which frankly don't work. To be a realist.
No, good. That's the business we're in. The question is on, I think Ananth discusses in his book also the boundary issue. I think does a wonderful job at summarizing it and mapping it out. But the narrative that at least I read in that chapter, which quotes actually Ambassador Rao also, and you read also Ambassador Menon, I'm sure, gave comments on, is that the Kashmir angle of 2019 has been used as an excuse by the Chinese and is actually not, going back to the 90s actually in 2000s, is not such a salient issue in how China has addressed the boundary issues. That's something you would agree with? I mean, it's again,
right. I think he's absolutely right. After all, Xi Jinping came to Mamallapuram after the status of Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir was changed. And they did what they had to, raised it at the Security Council, made noises. The Foreign Ministry spokesman said what he had to. But that didn't stop the summit, the informal summit, or the projections. And frankly, I heard Indians saying this is the cause long before I heard any Chinese. I think the Chinese picked it up from the Indians actually, and then decided, oh, this is good, this is useful, we can use this. The Indians believe it. I agree with Ananth actually. That's not the trigger.
Thank you, Ambassador Bennett. So we'll really try to end this now, but I can't resist in doing one last question to all of you very shortly. Whether, I think Ananth appeals in his book several times that we shouldn't do one of two extremes, either celebrating the Chinese model uncritically and saying, it's a wonderful system that has solved thousands of years of dilemmas about economic development and balance between freedom and Amartya Sen's argumentative Indian and various different types of freedom, nor should we, I think, also demonize the system and say, it's a system that is somehow irreparable, unreasonable, right, Ambassador Menon, like we discussed, and therefore really not worthy of any engagement. My question to each of you very shortly would be, do you agree there is a Chinese model? Because Ananth discusses this in the book several times. Is this really a model that is still under experimentation? Will we see changes? Or is there something that is already crystallized in terms of a system that is here to stay and that is, ossified in the good sense, but stabilized or ossified in the bad sense or stabilized in the good sense, however you want to look at it. Professor Chen, if we may start with you, because in Hong Kong, I think this is probably the question on the mind of many Hong Kongers that are dealing with a changing system in China that is affecting you deeply.
I would say China is still trying to work out a model for itself. If there is a Chinese model, then that model stopped working in the late 19th century. So since the second half of the 19th century, the Chinese society has been trying to find an answer, what will be the right workable model in the long run and on a sustained basis. I don't think the Chinese society has found that answer yet. I mean, don't let what we see at the moment fool ourselves thinking that, what is going on in China is going to be able to sustain for the next 50 years, let alone for the next 1 century. So whatever has worked to make the economic success possible, it's not necessarily due to the historically sustained Chinese model. So, I mean, the Industrial Revolution and the globalization played much bigger roles in allowing the last 4 decades of economic success for China. So I would not say that there is a Chinese model that can be applied anywhere else because that model has not been worked out yet, even within China.
Thank you, Professor Chen. And I'm sure one of the issues is certainly the various political systems that still coexist in greater China, including in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, if you want to look at it, right? So there's
partly because the economic system that made the 4 decades of economic success possible after 1978, it's not necessarily compatible exactly with the political system that Ananth's book talks about. So until the conflict is resolved between the economic side and the political side, we cannot really say there is a Chinese model that can sustain.
Thank you, Professor Chen. Ambassador Rao, may come to you. Do you agree? I mean, I would like to turn this around. I mean, Francis Fukuyama tells us the end of history of democracy and liberalism. Is this the end of history on the other side, that we actually see a system that is wedding authoritarianism, political control with capitalism? And this is going to be more and more of a, I mean, the chapter on technology, I think Ananth describes, is quite scary. He speaks about the first neo or Orwellian state of the 21st century, right? Where you have a social credit system and the Chinese state really controlling privacy and using artificial intelligence like no other state has used it so far to shape the preferences and to track the behavior of its citizens. Is this a new model that is here to stay and that we will be lured to emulate?
Well, I think as far as the Chinese system is concerned, you know, when you look at the global scene today, I think you see the perhaps the potential clash of two value systems, as it were. And on the other hand, we come from a long tradition of democracy and all the fundamental freedoms that we've enjoyed so much. And we have, in a sense, our whole economic bandwagon is in many ways hitched also to the political system that we have in our country, for instance. In the case of China, I remember after Tiananmen, when, you know, 1989, when Gorbachev had visited China at that time, the Soviet Union was collapsing literally before our eyes. And this whole debate in China about the question of glasnost versus perestroika, which should China really pursue and which should be really not allowed to raise its voice or raise its flag. And I think that debate has really not been concluded so far even in China, except that today you have a far more centralized system of leadership and literally a single point of failure in a sense. If that leadership is not able to deliver and able to you know, encompass China within its range of power as we move forward, then the future looks uncertain. Therefore, when you ask me whether the Chinese model will succeed, I think it is too early to say whether it will succeed. But there is I've always felt there is a sense of, there is a brittleness about it. The very fact that everything is so censored, you have this all-pervasive surveillance, you see the way they handle the news about the pandemic and the outbreak of COVID-19 in Wuhan in the early days. All these point to a value system that is being purveyed and being propagated by the leadership that you know, I don't know how the Chinese people in their hearts really react to all this. They have prosperity, they have much more freedom to move around and express themselves on certain aspects of the social compact, but without touching the role of the party or, you know, the really fundamental political questions. So I
Right.
think there must be a fundamental unease and dissatisfaction about that among most thinking Chinese, but perhaps we can't say at this moment where it will all lead.
Absolutely. I think as all models, I mean, models, of course, a simplification. All models are work in progress, including the Indian one, as we're seeing these days. And that's the fascinating part about, I think, these two societies with very different models. And in fact, Ananth, like Ananth describes in the book, two different structures in the Chinese state, right? You have the Communist Party parallel to the government and the bureaucrats, almost side by side, and the party, of course, coming out stronger and stronger over the last 7 to 10 years. Vikram, if I can't resist bringing you very quickly in, if you promise to be very short, because I think we still have a lot of people here, but I'm really interested in your perception in Bombay, sitting in Bombay and dealing with a lot of Indian companies. Is there a certain fascination with the Chinese model of big Indian companies working in tandem with the Indian state to develop the economy, and in that sense, somehow put democracy aside, or democracy almost as a delaying process and as an obstacle to development? Is there that sense often, at least in the business sectors?
I think the businessmen in Bombay would not look to define the economics of China in terms of a model, other than to say that it's capitalism with Chinese characteristics. What they're looking at are the supply chains, and clearly over the past several decades, China has been able to years, they've been able to establish efficient supply chains with China. And it's going to be increasingly difficult for them to remain competitive if those supply chains are disrupted. So as you have said, as Ananth has said, it's very, very difficult for anyone to consider or to look at the Chinese economy through a sort of binary prism, which says it's either this or that. It's a nuanced prism, and the Indian businessmen are very nuanced in their understanding of how the Chinese economy is progressing. And they are grudgingly actually quite, they acknowledge grudgingly perhaps the success that the Chinese have had in managing first the 2008 financial crisis, and now to an extent, the crisis that the global economy is facing today.
Thank you, Vikram. Ambassador Menon, I won't ask you a question because I'm sure you have a lot to share with us about this idea of a Chinese model. But one question which came from Suresh Nyopan, who's a journalist in Nepal, was, do we need to sort of worry about the Chinese model also gaining foothold in terms of norms, the politics, the governance in various countries in the region, and maybe even in India?
I think, you know, most countries around the world will pick and choose from what China has to offer. I mean, the trouble with being an ideological party like the Communist Party is they cannot admit that they don't know, that they're just muddling along. There's always been a Chinese model offered, and whether it was Maoism, permanent revolution, etc., etc. Deng, I think, was the exception, who was crossing the river by feeling the stones underfoot. But then the only way he could justify it was by saying that China is unique. And the transition to patriotic education and to the sense of victimhood, century of humiliation, also happened in his watch. Because he didn't want to get into external entanglements, you know, hide and bite. And so there is always going to be, from a party like the CCP, there will be a Chinese model. But I think people know that it's not a model which works on any other soil. China is unique in many, many ways, history, geography, you name it, political structure, and so on. But people will take what they can. If it's money with BRI, they'll take it. If you're a dictator, an autocrat who wants a surveillance system, wants to monitor everyone's phones, he'll take what he can get out of China. I mean, so for me, this is just the normal business of statecraft. But I don't think there's one Chinese model or one Chinese order, world order, which today is ripe and ready for export, or which has many friends. In fact, there are very few countries, even the closest friends of China, whether it's North Korea, whether it's Pakistan, whether it's Cambodia, who are most dependent on China, even they don't claim or say that they're following a Chinese model. In fact, they go exactly the opposite way. So I wouldn't worry too much about this. I would deal with the actual consequences in terms of what's happening to the world around us, whether it's in South Asia and so on, of China's actual actions rather than what she says or projects.
So is there a categorical difference between a deal between an Indian company and Huawei on 5G and an Indian company and, say, a German, Korean, or an American company that responds in some ways to rule of law? Is there a categorical difference, or is it just cynicism and pure business that should guide India's decision on data, for example, and 5G?
No, it can't be pure business because they all have a national security angle. And you pay national security professionals to be suspicious, to think bad thoughts and suspect everyone. And that's their job. And I think you need to look at whether it's a German company or a Chinese company or an American company. I think they should do their job the same, without fear or favor.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. Again, a very realist take, case by case, and look into the horse's mouth and assess to what extent it can be trusted or not. Ananth, the last word to you. We went well beyond our time, but it's been a fascinating discussion. Thanks again for bringing this book to us. I'll leave up the last words to you on whatever issue you'd like to emphasize, the model, the Chinese model, or the book, or maybe the next book you're going to write.
Well, thanks so much. You know, the only point that I'd say is I completely agree on the fact that I think it's a model that's evolving and adapting. Just as an example of one issue that didn't come up today, if you told me even 5-10 years ago what would be happening in Xinjiang today, for instance, that you'd have 1 million+ people who are forcibly being interned, I would have told you that that part of the China model is gone, and I would have been very skeptical. But then here we are today, looking at something that we thought would only happen in Maoist China in the 50s or 60s. So I would agree with the fact that it's evolving and adapting, and I think China's rulers themselves would be the first to, I think, privately admit that they themselves don't know in which direction it's going. But on that note, I would just want to thank you, Tino, for doing such an excellent job in bringing this together and in moderating this as well. And my deepest appreciation to you and Vikram and CSEP, not just for today, but for giving me this wonderful opportunity in 2018 and 2019, without which I think this book wouldn't have been possible. So thank you so much. And thank you also to Ambassador Rao, Ambassador Menon, Professor Chen, for spending way more time than you probably have. So thank you so much for being a part of this event today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ananth. I mean, one question from the audience was also actually about whether there is whether China has an India challenge. Maybe that could be your next book, and look at how India is looking at China and sort of doing the reverse. That would be certainly something interesting. And as always, I think I speak for Vikram in saying that CSEP, we value people that look deep into issues, spend the time like you did to get away from the daily noise, in particular in your section, in your segment of the media that happens a lot, to take the time to come into the silence of our boring think tank and research corridors and do some in-depth research and come out with this fabulous 400-page book that has really brought us a lot of food for thought. I want to thank all of you following up on Ananth for joining. Professor Chen, particularly you, it's getting late in Hong Kong. Thank you for staying with us and sharing your work. We hope to have you back in some ways as we do more work on China at CSEP over the next year or so. Ambassador Rao, thank you for joining us again and always kindly sharing and graciously your time on China, on the region, on South Asia. You've been a great support of our work. And certainly Ambassador Menon, who always makes time to speak to the foreign policy team, to guide our work on several issues. In fact, his India's Foreign Affairs Strategy paper that we released earlier this year addressed many of the issues we discussed today, and I think remains very timely today post Galvan crisis. Thank you also, Vikram, for joining us in your introductory remarks and staying on with us for these last 2 hours. Thanks all for joining, the participants, and HarperCollins for bringing out, of course, this book. Please do buy it and read it. It's a wonderful read. And thank you, Ananth, for choosing CSEP to have this discussion with us. Thank you all. Hope to see you at some future CSEP event over the next few weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.